The discovery in the ruins. November 2023, Professor Daniel Schwemmer's hands were shaking, and that terrified him. He'd been excavating Hittite sites for 23 years. He'd held royal seals, deciphered treaties between empires, touched clay that kings had touched 3,000 years ago. His hands never shook. But standing in the dim light of the conservation tent at Boğazköy-Hattusha, staring at a clay fragment the color of dried blood, Daniel Schwemmer felt something he hadn't experienced since his first year of graduate school. The electric jolt of discovering something that shouldn't exist. The tablet had been found that morning in the debris layer of the great temple complex, buried beneath centuries of collapsed stone and wind-blown soil. When the excavation team pulled it from the earth, still caked in dirt, the foreman had almost tossed it into the general collection bin. Just another fragment. Hattusha had yielded over 30,000 tablets since excavations began. They found religious texts every week, duplicates of prayers and rituals they'd catalogued hundreds of times. But when the conservation team cleaned this one, washing away 3,200 years of accumulated soil with soft brushes and distilled water, something became immediately apparent. The tablet was unusually small, roughly the size of a modern index card, and unusually thick, as if the scribe had been working with limited clay and needed to compress the text. The cuneiform impressions were crisp, preserved by the accidental firing when the temple burned during Hattusha's final destruction around 1200 BCE. Each wedge mark was sharp enough that Schwemmer could see where the scribe's stylus had hesitated, where corrections had been made, where the hand had pressed harder for emphasis. The script was Hittite cuneiform, familiar, the writing system he'd spent his entire career studying. But the words were wrong, all of them. Schwemmer had recognized it immediately, the way you'd recognize someone speaking gibberish with your native accent. The cuneiform signs were arranged in grammatical patterns, clear sentence structures, obvious verb forms, and noun cases. This wasn't random scratches or practice exercises. This was language, sophisticated and intentional, written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But it wasn't Hittite. It wasn't Luwian, the empire's other major language. It wasn't Palaic, Hattic, Hurrian, or any of the dozen other tongues documented in Anatolia during the Bronze Age. He'd read thousands of Hittite tablets. He could identify linguistic patterns the way a musician identifies keys and chords. This text had Indo-European grammatical bones. He could see that much in the first 3 lines. Verb conjugations that felt distantly related to Hittite. Noun declensions that suggested the same ancient language family tree. But the vocabulary, the specific constructions, the way phrases were assembled, it was all unfamiliar. Like hearing someone speak a Romance language you'd never encountered, recognizing the Latin roots, but unable to understand a single sentence. Schwemmer set the tablet down carefully on the foam padding and stepped back. His heart was pounding. He counted to 10, then picked it up again, hoping he'd been mistaken, hoping fatigue or poor lighting had made him see patterns that weren't there. The text was still incomprehensible. He did something he'd never done in 23 years of fieldwork. He called his department chair in Germany at 2 a.m. local time. "I need you to look at something," Schwemmer said, when the groggy voice answered. "Right now. I'm sending photos." 15 minutes later, Professor Elizabeth Bergen was staring at the images on her computer screen in Würzburg, 2,000 kilometers away. Schwemmer watched her face on the video call, waiting for the moment of recognition he'd experienced. It came exactly when he expected, about 40 seconds in, when Bergen's eyes widened and she leaned so close to her monitor that her nose nearly touched the screen. "Daniel," she said slowly, "what am I looking at? I was hoping you could tell me. This is from Hattusha. You pulled this today." 6 hours ago. Bergen was silent for nearly a minute, scrolling through the images. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming very careful, very precise. "This isn't Hittite. I know. It's not Luwian either. Look at line 4. That verbal construction doesn't exist in any Luwian dialect." "I know." The noun cases are wrong for Palaic. The vocabulary doesn't match Hattic. She stopped abruptly. Daniel, are you telling me this is a completely unknown language? I don't know what I'm telling you. That's why I called. What Bergen said next, Schwemmer would remember for the rest of his life. Don't let anyone else see this tablet. Not yet. If this is what I think it is, we need to be absolutely certain before we tell anyone. Because if we're wrong, our careers are over. And if we're right... She trailed off, and Schwemmer saw something like fear cross her face. If we're right, everything we thought we knew about the Hittite Empire is incomplete. The next 6 months became a masterclass in academic paranoia and obsessive scholarship. Schwemmer assembled a team of 4 people, specialists he trusted absolutely. They worked in a locked room in the Hattusha research facility, cataloguing the tablet under a false inventory number so curious colleagues wouldn't ask questions. Every photograph was encrypted. Every email discussing the project used coded language, referring to the tablet as the Boğazköy anomaly, in case anyone was monitoring their communications. It sounds ridiculous in retrospect, this level of secrecy over a clay fragment, but all of them understood what was at stake. In archaeology and linguistics, claiming to discover a new language is career-defining if you're right and career-ending if you're wrong. Misidentifications are remembered forever. The scholar who announced a new Mayan glyph that turned out to be water damage. The linguist who declared a unique dialect that was actually just bad handwriting in a medieval manuscript. Academic failure stories, cautionary tales told to graduate students. This had to be bulletproof. They started with the most tedious work imaginable, systematic comparison. Every single word in the tablet was checked against comprehensive databases of every known Anatolian language. Hittite, Luwian, Palaic, Hattic, Hurrian, even fragmentary languages known from only a handful of words. They checked Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Bronze Age. They checked Sumerian loanwords. They checked scribal errors and unusual spellings. Nothing matched. 3 months in, they were certain the language was Indo-European, part of the same vast family tree that includes English, Greek, Sanskrit, and most European tongues. The grammatical structures proved it. The way verbs conjugated, the pattern of noun declensions, the syntax of subordinate clauses, all of it showed Indo-European DNA. But it was a branch of that family tree no one had ever documented, a linguistic lineage that had left no other trace in the historical record. The content of the tablet itself was frustratingly opaque. Without understanding the language, they could only make educated guesses based on format and context. It appeared to be religious, probably a ritual invocation. The repetitive structure suggested prayers or formulaic chants. There were what looked like deity names, proper nouns that appeared multiple times. But without a bilingual text, without a Rosetta Stone to provide translations, they were working in the dark. Then, in month 5, a graduate student named Elif Korkmaz made a breakthrough that changed everything. Elif was the youngest member of the team, 26 years old, a specialist in Hittite religious texts, finishing her dissertation on Bronze Age ritual practices. She'd been assigned the task of analysing the tablet's final section, the closing lines that in Hittite ritual texts typically contained formulaic phrases about where and how the ceremony should be performed. She'd been staring at the same 3 lines for 6 hours, her eyes burning from the close work, when something clicked. A phrase structure she recognised from hundreds of other tablets. Not the words themselves, but the grammatical container they were in. In Hittite ritual texts, when priests recorded ceremonies from foreign cultures, they often ended with a specific formula. In the manner of the place name land. Elif's hands started shaking as she traced the cuneiform with her fingertip. This phrase had the same structure. Subject, prepositional phrase, locative noun. And right there, in the penultimate line, was a proper noun she could actually read, because it was spelled in standard Hittite cuneiform, Kalašma. She stood up so fast, her chair fell over. "Professor Schwemmer!" The entire team crowded around her workstation as she explained. Kalašma, a place name that appeared in a handful of other Hittite documents. Brief references in administrative texts. A minor kingdom or tribal territory somewhere on the empire's northern frontier. Scholars had noted the name over the decades but knew virtually nothing about it. No one had ever found architecture or pottery or weapons that could definitively be identified as Kalašmian. No king lists, no treaties, no detailed descriptions. Just a name mentioned in passing, a place that had diplomatic or tributary relations with the Hittite court sometime around 1300 to 1200 BCE. And now they had its language, the actual words its people spoke. This isn't just a new language, Bergen said quietly, still staring at Elif's translation. This is a ghost. A kingdom so completely erased from history that we weren't even sure it really existed. And here it is, speaking to us. That night, after the team had left, Schwimmer sat alone in the locked workroom with the tablet resting on the conservation foam in front of him. He'd turned off the overhead fluorescence, working only by the warm glow of his desk lamp, and in that light, the ancient clay seemed almost alive, the wedge marks casting tiny shadows that shifted as he breathed. He thought about the scribe who'd made this tablet 3,200 years ago, some priest or religious specialist in the Hittite capital, tasked with recording a ritual from a distant part of the empire. Had that scribe understood the Kalašmian language, or were they just copying phonetically, preserving sounds without comprehension? Had they known they were documenting something rare, something that might otherwise be lost? Or was this just routine work? One tablet among thousands, a task finished and forgotten by sunset. The scribe couldn't have imagined that their work would survive the empire's collapse, the burning of Hattusha, the long silence of the Dark Ages. They couldn't have known that 3,000 years later, people speaking languages that didn't yet exist would gather in a room lit by technology that would seem like magic, desperately trying to understand these words. Schwimmer carefully lifted the tablet, feeling its weight in his hands. It was so small, so fragile. If the temple had burned at a slightly different temperature, it would have crumbled. If it had been buried 10 meters to the left, groundwater would have dissolved it. If the excavation team had been careless that morning, it would have shattered. 30,000 tablets had been found at Hattusha over a century of excavation. But archaeologists estimated that less than 5% of the site had been fully explored. The rest remained buried under tons of collapsed stone and accumulated earth. How many other languages were out there in the darkness? How many cultures had been swallowed so completely by time that even their names had been forgotten? This tablet had survived by pure chance. One voice from Kalašma, preserved in clay and fire and silence. But Schwimmer knew, with a certainty that felt like vertigo, that for every voice that survived, hundreds had been lost forever, maybe thousands. He set the tablet down and walked to the window. Outside, the ruins of Hattusha stretched across the hillside, massive stone foundations and scattered column drums, marking where palaces and temples had stood when this city commanded an empire. Beyond them, the Anatolian plateau extended to the horizon, dark and vast under a sky brilliant with stars. Somewhere out there had been Kalašma, a kingdom of people who spoke this language, who built cities and grew crops and told stories and raised children and worshipped their storm god. All of it gone. All of it erased so thoroughly that until today, the world didn't even know they'd had their own tongue. In 6 months, they'd publish their findings. The academic world would erupt. Conferences would be organized. Graduate students would write dissertations. The language would have a name, Kalašmian, tongue of the Kalašma land. But that night, alone in the workroom, Schwimmer felt something closer to grief than triumph. They'd discovered a language, but in doing so, they'd revealed just how much had been lost. The ancient world, he realized, was far stranger and more complex than anyone had imagined, and they'd only just begun to understand how much they didn't know. The empire of 1,000 tongues, 3 weeks after identifying the Kalašmian tablet, Dr. Elif Korkmaz made a discovery that should have been impossible. She'd been assigned the tedious task of cross-referencing every mention of Kalašma in the existing Hattusha archives, hoping to find some context for the mysterious kingdom. The published catalogues listed 5 documents containing the name, 3 administrative texts, 1 diplomatic letter, and a fragment of a treaty. Nothing exciting. Brief mentions, a few lines each, the kind of bureaucratic scraps that fill archaeological databases but rarely tell you anything meaningful. Elif had requested digital scans of all 5 tablets from the museum collections in Ankara and Berlin, where they were housed. She was working late in the Hattusha research facility, the only person still in the building at 11 p.m., drinking her 4th coffee of the night and squinting at high-resolution images on dual monitors. The first 3 tablets were exactly what the catalogues described. Boring. A tribute record listing horses and copper ingots sent from Kalašma to the Hittite king. A border dispute over grazing rights. A roster of soldiers from various territories, including 12 men from Kalašma serving in a campaign against someone whose name was damaged and unreadable. The 4th tablet was different. It was catalogued as diplomatic correspondence, fragmentary, circa 1240 BCE. The description noted that it mentioned Kalašma and another kingdom called Archaeologists in the context of military alliance. Standard stuff. Elif almost didn't bother reading the full translation. But something about the tablet's photograph caught her eye. The cuneiform was unusually dense, packed tightly together, and there were marks in the margins that looked like scribal annotations, notes added by whoever had originally filed this document in the Hittite archives. She pulled up the published translation, written by a German scholar in 1983. It was brief, only 6 readable lines from what had originally been a much longer text. The tablet was severely damaged, with large sections missing. The translation read, "And the king of Kalašma has agreed to send against the rebels of the mountain land." But the king of Archaeologists warns that the language of ritual must not be, or the gods will turn their faces away. Let the priests of Kalašma, in their own tongue, as has been the custom. Elif read it 3 times. Then she zoomed in on the photograph, focusing on those marginal annotations she'd noticed. The notes were in a different hand than the main text, smaller, squeezed into the narrow space along the tablet's edge. She could make out individual cuneiform signs, but the abbreviated scribal shorthand made them difficult to interpret. She copied the signs into her translation software and waited while the database searched for matching phrases. When the results appeared, her coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. The marginal note read, "Ritual texts of Kalašma stored in Archive Room 7, tablets 1 to 24. Language instruction provided by Tarakura of Kalašma, priest, in the 12th year of Mu'tali. 24 tablets, not 1. 24 tablets of Kalašmian ritual texts, carefully catalogued, stored in a specific archive room with the name of the Kalašmian priest who taught the language to Hittite scribes. Elif's hands were shaking as she grabbed her phone and called Shwema. It was nearly midnight. She didn't care. "We've been looking at this wrong," she said the moment he answered. "The tablet we found isn't unique. It's not the only one. There were at least 24 Kalašmian texts in the Hattusha archives. The Hittites had an entire collection." Shwema was silent for a long moment. "Elif, we've excavated Hattusha for over a century. 30,000 tablets have been recovered. If there were 24 Kalašmian tablets, where are they?" "That's the question," she said. "Where are they?" The next morning, the entire team gathered in the workroom. Elif presented her finding, projecting the marginal note onto the large screen. The implications were staggering and deeply disturbing. 24 tablets meant the Hittites hadn't just casually preserved a single Kalašmian ritual. They'd made a systematic effort to document the language, probably as part of a larger program of cultural preservation that the empire was famous for. A Kalašmian priest named Tarakura had come to Hattusha, possibly as part of a diplomatic mission, and had worked with Hittite scribes to record ritual texts in his native language. This had happened during the reign of Mu'tali II, who ruled from approximately 1295 to 1272 BCE. So roughly 1283 BCE, if the 12th year reference was accurate. The tablets had been carefully catalogued and stored in a specific archive room. And then, at some point in the next 3,000 plus years, 23 of those 24 tablets had vanished. Fire damage, suggested one of the team members, a Belgian archaeologist named Marc Deschamps. When Hattusha burned around 1200 BCE, most of the archives were destroyed. We're lucky we have 30,000 tablets. Originally, there might have been hundreds of thousands. But we have one Kalašmian tablet, Bergen pointed out. It survived the fire. It was preserved by the heat, baked hard. Why would the others all be destroyed but this one survive? Random chance, Mark offered, but his voice was uncertain. Schwemmer was studying the photograph of the diplomatic letter, zooming in on different sections. This marginal note says the tablets were stored in Archive Room 7. Do we know where that was? Has Room 7 been excavated? Elif pulled up the site maps of Hattusha on her laptop. The Great Temple complex, where most of the tablets had been found, was a vast structure with multiple storage rooms, administrative offices, and religious chambers. Archaeologists had been excavating it systematically since the 1930s, but significant portions remained unexcavated or only partially explored. Room 7, she murmured, scrolling through excavation reports. Here, Archive Room 7 was identified in a 1952 excavation season. It's in the northeastern section of the temple complex, near the administrative wing. The excavators found... She paused, reading. They found heavily damaged tablet fragments, mostly illegible. Fire damage was extensive. They recovered approximately 300 fragments, but only about 40 were substantial enough to attempt translation. And those 40 tablets, Bergen said slowly. What were they? Elif clicked through the catalogue entries. Administrative records mostly. Grain disbursements, personnel rosters, one religious text in Hittite. Nothing in any minority language. Certainly nothing catalogued as Kalašmian, but... She looked up at Schwemmer. In 1952, no one knew Kalašmian existed. If there were damaged fragments in an unknown language, the excavators might have just labelled them language uncertain or unidentified dialect and put them in storage. The implications hung in the air like smoke. We need to go through the storage collections, Schwemmer said. Every fragment from Room 7 that was labelled unidentified. If even one more Kalašmian tablet survived, even badly damaged, it could give us enough vocabulary to start actually translating the language. What followed was 3 weeks of the most frustrating work any of them had ever experienced. The fragments from the 1952 excavation of Archive Room 7 were scattered across multiple institutions. Some were in Ankara, in the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations. Others had been sent to Berlin for study and never returned. A few had ended up in Istanbul, and many were simply listed as storage, location uncertain, in database entries that hadn't been updated in decades. Elif and Mark spent days on the phone with museum curators, archive directors, and collection managers, trying to track down boxes of tablet fragments that had been photographed once in the 1950s and then forgotten. Some institutions were helpful, others were bureaucratic nightmares, requiring formal written requests that took weeks to process. They finally located 73 fragments that had originated from Archive Room 7 and had been labelled language uncertain or unidentified. Digital photographs were sent to Hattusha. The team divided them up and began the painstaking process of examination. Most were useless, too damaged, only a few cuneiform signs visible, not enough to identify a language. But fragment number 43, photographed in Berlin's collection, made Schwemmer's pulse quicken. It was small, roughly triangular, broken on all sides, perhaps a quarter of the original tablet. But the cuneiform was clear, and the text was dense, and when Schwemmer compared the grammatical structures to their one complete Kalašmian tablet, the patterns matched. This is Kalašmian, he said quietly. This is a second tablet. The team crowded around his monitor. The fragment contained perhaps 15 readable words, not enough to translate without more context, but enough to confirm that at least 2 of Tarakura's 24 tablets had survived, which meant 22 were still missing. They're not all destroyed, Bergen said, staring at the fragment. If 2 survived, others might have too. They're just lost in collections somewhere, mislabeled, unidentified, sitting in storage boxes that no one's looked at in 70 years. Or still buried, Elif added. The excavation report from 1952 says they didn't fully clear room 7. There was structural instability, part of the ceiling had collapsed. They decided it was too dangerous to continue. They excavated maybe 60% of the room and sealed the rest. Schwimmer leaned back in his chair, a strange expression on his face. So, somewhere beneath Hattusha, there might be intact Kalašmian tablets. Multiple tablets. Maybe even Tarakura's original teaching materials, vocabulary lists, grammar explanations, the kind of thing a priest would create if he was instructing foreign scribes in his language. We need to go back, Mark said immediately. We need to reopen room 7, finish the excavation. That's years of work, Bergen cautioned. Permits, funding, structural stabilization, proper excavation with modern techniques. We're talking a major project. Then we start now, Schwimmer said. Because if those tablets are down there, if we can find even 5 or 6 more substantial texts, we could actually translate this language. We could read what Tarakura wrote. We could hear what the people of Kalašma were saying to their gods. That evening, Elif stayed late again, working through the digital catalogue of Hattusha tablets. But this time, she wasn't looking for mentions of Kalašma in the translations. She was looking at photographs of tablet fragments, thousands of them, searching for the distinctive grammatical patterns they'd identified in Kalašmian. It was like looking for a specific face in a crowd of thousands. Exhausting, probably futile. The cuneiform all looked similar at first glance. But she'd spent months now staring at Kalašmian text, and her eyes had learned to recognize its rhythms. At 2 a.m., she found something. Fragment 1847K, excavated in 1963, labeled Unidentified Language, possibly Luwian dialect. The photograph was low quality, scanned from a 1960s black and white film, negative, but she could make out enough. The verbal constructions, the noun cases, the way the clauses were structured. This was Kalašmian, a third tablet. She kept searching. By dawn, she'd identified 2 more possible fragments. Maybe Kalašmian, maybe not. The photographs were too poor to be certain. But possible. When Schwimmer arrived at 7 a.m., he found Elif still at her desk, surrounded by empty coffee cups, her eyes red from screen strain. I think they're everywhere, she said without preamble. The Kalašmian tablets. I think when the archives burned and the building collapsed, the tablets shattered and scattered. Pieces ended up in different rooms, mixed with other languages, catalogued separately. We've been finding them for 100 years. We just didn't know what we were looking at. Schwimmer sat down slowly. How many have you found? 3 definite, 5 possible. But I've only searched about 10% of the photographic database. If that ratio holds... She did quick mental math. There could be 50 fragments of Kalašmian text in existing collections, just sitting there, unidentified. 50 fragments, Schwimmer repeated, from 24 original tablets. That's not random destruction, that's systematic shattering. They looked at each other, and the same thought occurred to both of them simultaneously. The building didn't just burn, Bergen said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard her arrive. It was deliberately destroyed. When the Hittite Empire collapsed, when Hattusha was abandoned, someone burned the archives intentionally. Not random fire from invasion. Deliberate burning. Archaeological evidence has suggested this for years, but no one's been sure why. They were erasing the records, Elif whispered. Someone wanted the archives destroyed. Or, Schwimmer said slowly, they wanted specific records destroyed, specific languages, specific knowledge, and Kalašmian was among them. The room fell silent. Outside, the sun was rising over the ruins of Hattusha, illuminating the massive stones where an empire had stood, where scribes had carefully preserved the languages of a dozen cultures, where someone, at the end of everything, had tried to ensure that those languages would be forgotten forever. "We're not just finding a lost language," Bergen said quietly. "We're finding what someone tried to erase, and we still don't know why." Decoding the silence. May 2024, Professor Schwemmer stood in Archive Room 7 for the first time in his life, and the silence felt like pressure against his eardrums. The excavation had taken 6 months to approve, another 4 months to prepare. Structural engineers had stabilized the collapsed ceiling with steel reinforcements. Ground-penetrating radar had mapped what lay beneath the rubble. A team of 12 specialists had been assembled, each one sworn to confidentiality until they understood what they were dealing with. The Turkish Ministry of Culture had granted permission for a limited exploratory excavation, 3 weeks maximum, with the understanding that if nothing significant was found, the site would be resealed. But standing here now, in this underground chamber that hadn't been fully exposed to daylight in 3,200 years, Schwemmer knew they were going to find something significant. He could feel it the way you can feel a storm coming. The room was larger than the 1952 excavators had realized. What they'd identified as a collapsed wall was actually a partition, separating the main archive space from a smaller inner chamber. The ground-penetrating radar had detected dense concentrations of clay tablets in that inner room, but the resolution wasn't good enough to estimate how many or in what condition. Elif Korkmaz stood beside him, wearing full excavation gear, knee pads, dust mask hanging around her neck, LED headlamp, gloves. She was staring at the sealed partition with an expression somewhere between hope and dread. "The 1952 team stopped here," she said, gesturing to where the old excavation ended. "They hit structural instability and decided it was too dangerous. But look," she pointed her flashlight at the partition wall. "Those stones aren't fallen debris. That's deliberate construction. Someone walled off this inner chamber." Schwemmer moved closer, examining the stonework. She was right. The blocks were carefully fitted, mortared in place. This wasn't collapse. This was intentional closure. "When?" he asked. "That's the question," Elif said. "Was this sealed during the Hittite period, maybe to protect valuable archives? Or was it sealed later, during the final destruction?" Marc Deschamps, who'd been setting up the photographic equipment, paused and looked at them. "Or sealed by the 1952 excavators when they realized the ceiling was unstable." "The excavation reports don't mention sealing anything," Elif replied. "They just say they stopped work and backfilled the unstable section." Schwemmer ran his gloved hand along the ancient mortar. "Only one way to find out." The process of opening the sealed chamber took 3 days. They couldn't just smash through. Every stone had to be photographed, documented, carefully removed and catalogued. Archaeological excavation is destruction. Once you dig something up, you can never put it back exactly as it was. Every decision matters. When they finally removed the last stone and shone lights into the inner chamber, Elif actually gasped. Shelves, wooden shelves, long since rotted and collapsed, but the clay tablets they'd held were still there, organized in neat rows where they'd fallen when the wood gave way. Not scattered fragments, not fire-damaged scraps. Intact tablets, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stacked like books in a library. "Oh my God," Bergen breathed, squeezing into the opening behind Schwemmer. "It's a sealed archive. They walled it off before the fire reached it." The team worked for the next 2 weeks in a state of controlled frenzy. Each tablet had to be carefully excavated, photographed in situ, then lifted and transported to the conservation facility. The inner chamber yielded 147 tablets, most in remarkably good condition. Without fire damage, they hadn't been accidentally baked and hardened, which meant they were more fragile, but it also meant the cuneiform impressions were pristine, sharp, readable. The tablets were in multiple languages: Hittite, Luwian, Hurrian. But there were others too, texts in scripts that didn't match any known language. The team photographed everything, working 18-hour days, knowing their 3-week permit was running out. On the 17th day, Elif was cataloguing tablet number 89 when she saw the word that changed everything: Tarakura. The name was written in Hittite cuneiform at the top of the tablet, followed by a phrase she translated as "Instruction in the language of Kalašma, prepared by Tarakura, priest, for the scribes of the great king." Her hands started shaking so badly she had to set the tablet down. "Professor Schwemmer," she called, her voice cracking. "I need you to see this." The tablet was extraordinary. It was large, nearly twice the size of normal tablets, and covered on both sides with dense text. The format was immediately recognizable to anyone who'd studied ancient language instruction. Vocabulary lists. The left column was in Hittite, the right column was in Kalašmian. Hundreds of words, organized by category: body parts, animals, weather phenomena, agricultural terms, religious vocabulary. And at the bottom of the tablet, a section labeled in Hittite as grammar patterns, showing how Kalašmian verbs conjugated, how nouns declined, how sentences were structured. It was a Rosetta Stone, not a bilingual text telling the same story in 2 languages, but something even better, a teaching manual, created by a native speaker to help foreigners learn his language. "This is it," Schwemmer whispered. "This is how we translate Kalašmian. This is how we actually read what they wrote." Over the next 3 days, before the excavation permit expired and the site had to be sealed again, the team found 6 more instructional tablets by Tarakura. Each one covered different aspects of Kalašmian language and culture: grammar, vocabulary, religious terminology. Even a tablet that appeared to be a collection of common phrases and idioms, the kind of thing you'd teach to diplomats or merchants who needed to communicate with Kalašmian speakers. The tablets revealed a language of stunning sophistication. Kalašmian was Indo-European, related to Hittite and Luwian, but with distinctive features that set it apart. It had 8 grammatical cases for nouns, more than Hittite's 7. It had a complex verbal system with subtle distinctions in aspect and mood that allowed speakers to express fine gradations of certainty, obligation, and intention. It had borrowed vocabulary from Hattic and Hurrian, suggesting centuries of cultural contact with non-Indo-European neighbours. But what struck the linguists most powerfully was the religious vocabulary. Kalašmian had elaborate terminology for ritual purity, for different types of divine presence, for the relationship between humans and gods. It was the language of people who'd thought deeply about the sacred, who'd developed sophisticated theological concepts. "Listen to this," Bergen said one evening, translating from one of Tarakura's tablets. He's explaining the Kalašmian word tawana. The Hittite equivalent would be something like sacred or holy, but Tarakura says that's not quite right. He writes, "Tawana is the quality of something that bridges the world of gods and the world of humans. It is not merely blessed by the gods, it exists simultaneously in both realms. A mountain can be tawana, a river can be tawana. A person who has been touched by divine presence becomes tawana, and this quality cannot be removed, only passed to others through ritual." "They had a word for liminality," Elif said softly, "for the threshold between sacred and profane. That's sophisticated religious philosophy." Using Tarakura's instructional tablets as a key, the team began translating the ritual texts they'd found. It was painstaking work. Even with vocabulary lists and grammar guides, ancient languages are never straightforward. Words have multiple meanings. Idioms don't translate directly. Cultural contexts are lost. But slowly, sentence by sentence, the Kalašmian texts began to speak. The first complete translation was of the small tablet Schwemmer had discovered in November 2023, the one that had started everything. It turned out to be a prayer to a storm god named Tarhunza, a name related to similar storm deities in other Anatolian cultures, asking for rain to end a drought. Tarhunza of the high peaks, you who command the clouds, hear the words of your people who dwell in the valley of Kalašma. 3 seasons have passed without rain. The springs have failed. The grain withers. The cattle grow thin. We have made the proper offerings. We have maintained the sacred places. We have kept ourselves tawana as you commanded. Now we ask, remember your people. Send the rain-bearing winds from the north. Fill our cisterns, green our fields, restore what the dry seasons have taken. We speak to you in the old words, the words of our fathers, the words that have always reached your ears. Do not turn away from the language of Kalašma. Reading it, Šwema felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. These weren't just ancient words. This was desperation. Real people facing drought, famine, watching their crops fail and their animals die, turning to their God with a plea that mixed ritual formality with genuine fear. And that last line, do not turn away from the language of Kalašma, hit him like a punch. It suggested that speaking to the gods in your own language mattered, that the Kalašmians believed their deity understood and valued their specific tongue. It was a theological claim, but also a cultural one. Our language is sacred. Our words have power. We matter. When was this tablet written? Bergen asked. Šwema checked the archaeological context. Based on the stratigraphic layer where it was found, probably around 1220 to 1200 BCE, the final decades of the Hittite Empire, maybe the final decades of Kalašma itself. They were silent for a moment, contemplating that. The drought the prayer described might have been one of the climate catastrophes that contributed to the Bronze Age collapse. The desperation in the text might have been justified. The rain might never have come. Over the following months, working from their base in Germany with high-resolution photographs of all the tablets, the team translated more texts. They found prayers for healing, for victory in battle, for safe childbirth, for good harvests. They found a remarkable hymn describing the creation of the world, in which the storm god Tarhunza battled a serpent of chaos, a mythological theme that appeared in various forms across ancient Near Eastern cultures. They found a ritual for purifying someone who had accidentally committed sacrilege, which involved complex symbolic actions and recitations that had to be performed at specific times of day. They found instructions for maintaining sacred groves, for propitiating mountain spirits, for interpreting weather omens. Each text opened a window into Kalašmian culture, revealing a people who saw their landscape as alive with divine presence, who believed that humans could become tawana, liminal, sacred, existing between worlds, through proper ritual action. But alongside the religious texts, they found something that troubled them, references to the time of forgetting. Multiple tablets mentioned this phrase. One prayer asked Tarhunza to protect the language of Kalašma during the time of forgetting that the priests have foreseen. Another ritual text included instructions for when the old words are no longer spoken daily, but must be preserved by the sacred keepers. They knew, Elif said, staring at the translations. The Kalašmians knew their language was dying. These texts aren't just rituals. They're preservation efforts. They're trying to save their language. Šwema pulled up the chronological data. The tablets that mentioned the time of forgetting all dated to the late 13th century BCE, roughly 1220 to 1200. The same period when Tarakura had come to Hattusha to teach Kalašmian to Hittite scribes. Tarakura wasn't just a diplomatic envoy, he said slowly. He was on a preservation mission. The Kalašmian language was already endangered, maybe because younger generations were switching to Hittite or Luwian, maybe because of population decline. Tarakura came to the Hittite capital to create a permanent record, to ensure that even if Kalašmian stopped being spoken, the sacred texts would survive. But why would a language die while the culture was still intact? Mark asked. Usually languages disappear when cultures are conquered or assimilated. Was Kalašma under that kind of pressure? They searched through the Hittite administrative texts for references to Kalašma in the late 13th century BCE. What they found suggested a kingdom in decline. The tribute records showed decreasing payments. The military rosters showed fewer Kalašmian soldiers serving in Hittite campaigns. There was a fragmentary text, badly damaged, that seemed to describe a plague or epidemic affecting the northern territories, with Kalašma specifically mentioned. Population collapse, Bergen said. Disease, or famine, or both. The kingdom was dying. Tarakura knew it. He came to Hattusha to save what could be saved. The language, the rituals, the sacred knowledge. He taught Hittite scribes how to properly preserve Kalašmian texts, created instructional materials so that even after the last native speaker died, someone could still read the prayers and perform the rituals correctly. But it didn't work, Elif said quietly. The Hittite Empire collapsed 20 years later. Hattusha burned. The archives were destroyed or sealed. And Kalašmian became exactly what Tarakura feared. A forgotten language, unspoken for 3,000 years, preserved only in clay fragments that no one could read. That evening, Schwema sat alone in his office in Würzburg, staring at the translation of one final Kalašmian text they'd completed that day. It was short, just 8 lines, found on a small tablet that had been in Tarakura's teaching collection. Unlike the formal religious texts, this one was personal, almost like a diary entry. I am Tarakura, priest of Tarhunza, keeper of the sacred groves of Kalašma. I write these words in the 12th year of Muwatalli, in the city of Hattusha. I have taught the Hittite scribes our language, our rituals, our sacred names. They have written everything down carefully, as I instructed, but I fear this knowledge will not last. Already in my homeland, the young speak more Hittite than Kalašmian. Already the sacred groves are untended, the old rituals forgotten. I have done what I can. The rest belongs to the gods. Schwema read it 3 times. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the German city lights, so far in time and space from Bronze Age Anatolia. Tarakura had been trying to preserve his culture, his language, his people's sacred knowledge. He'd failed. Kalašma had been forgotten, its language lost, its kingdom so thoroughly erased that modern archaeologists hadn't even been certain it existed. But now, 3,200 years later, Tarakura's words were being read again. His language was being spoken aloud in university seminars. His gods' names were being written in academic papers. His preservation effort, which had seemed to fail so completely, had succeeded after all. Just 3,000 years too late to save anyone. What the earth still hides. September 2025, the academic world exploded. The publication of Kalašmian, a newly identified Indo-European language from Bronze Age Anatolia, triggered a media frenzy that none of the team had anticipated. Within 48 hours, the paper had been downloaded over 50,000 times. CNN ran a segment. The BBC interviewed Schwema via satellite. Lost language discovered. After 3,200 years, screamed the headlines. But 3 days after publication, an email arrived that changed everything. It came from a retired schoolteacher named Mehmet Yilmaz, living in a small town called Devrek in northern Turkey. He wrote in careful English, "Dear Professor Schwema, I read about your discovery with great interest. My family has lived in this region for many generations. We have old songs that our grandmothers sang, very old, in a language nobody understands anymore. When I saw the Kalašmian words published in the newspaper, some looked familiar. I have recordings if you would like to hear them." Elif was on a plane to Turkey 2 days later. The songs were impossible. Mehmet's mother, a woman in her 80s named Ayşe, sang them in a quavering voice while Elif recorded. Lullabies, harvest songs, wedding chants. The melodies were recognizably Turkish, modern. But scattered throughout were phrases in another language, words that Ayşe couldn't translate. "That's just how the songs go," she explained. "My mother taught me, her mother taught her, back and back. We sing the old words, even though we don't know what they mean anymore. When Elif played the recordings for Schwemmer that night, he listened 3 times before speaking. "Play the wedding chant again." She did. Schwemmer pulled up Tarikura's vocabulary lists. "Tawana Shulmani, Parash iya Weldura," he murmured. Then, very quietly, "Elif, that's Kalašmian. Sacred union, blessed by the mountain. It's a wedding blessing from 3,200 years ago, preserved in a Turkish folk song." The silence on the call stretched for nearly a minute. "How?" Elif finally whispered. "I don't know." Over the next 6 weeks, they received 200 similar emails. Most were wishful thinking, pattern matching where no pattern existed. But 11 contained genuine Kalašmian fragments: a spring planting ritual, a counting rhyme, a Greek folk song with a refrain that matched, word for word, a line from Tarikura's tablets. The language hadn't died, not completely. It had fossilized in ritual contexts, preserved by people who'd forgotten the meanings, but remembered that the words mattered. But the emails brought something else, something that made Schwemmer's hands shake when he read them. References to archaeological sites that had never been professionally excavated. Ruins that local people called by names that sounded disturbingly Kalašmian. A hilltop fortress, Kalaštepe. A valley, Tarhan, possibly related to Tarhunza, the storm god. A sacred spring, Tawana Su. "We need to survey these sites," Mark said urgently. "If even one is an actual Kalašmian settlement, we could find their kingdom." The Turkish authorities granted permission in November 2025. The team focused on 3 sites in the mountains between Kastamonu and Çankara, matching vague Hittite geographical references to Kalašma. The first 2 sites were Roman era, disappointing. The third site, Kalaštepe, was different. The geophysical survey revealed extensive structures beneath the topsoil. Not a village, a substantial town with fortification walls, a large central building, organized residential areas. This was a regional center, possibly the capital of a small kingdom. On the 4th day, a Turkish archaeologist named Selin Demir found something in an eroded gully. A stone block, partially buried, with carving on one face. "Professor," she called quietly, "you need to see this." The script wasn't cuneiform. It was linear characters, precisely cut into stone, similar in style to Luwian hieroglyphics, but with completely different symbols. Schwemmer's voice shook. Could this be indigenous Kalašmian writing, something they used before adopting Hittite cuneiform? They excavated around the block carefully. It was part of a gateway or entrance marker. As they exposed more carving, a dedication text emerged, the kind rulers erected when building important structures. That night, Schwemmer couldn't sleep. If Kalašma had developed its own writing system, they weren't a minor tributary kingdom. They were sophisticated enough to achieve literacy independently, significant enough to build monumental architecture with royal inscriptions. Everything the Hittite texts had suggested was wrong. Kalašma hadn't been a backwater. It had been a civilization. 3 weeks later, a specialist at Leiden University sent a tentative translation of the stone inscription, working backward from known Kalašmian words. Tahu, of Kalašma, son of, in the year of his reign, built this gate to honor the sacred mountain. Let those who enter remember, the old words have power, the old ways endure. What we build in stone will outlast what we write in clay. Schwemmer read it sitting alone in his office at midnight. What we build in stone will outlast what we write in clay. But it hadn't. The stone gate had fallen. The city had been abandoned. Even its name had degraded into meaningless sounds. Kalaštepe, some hill. The clay tablets, fragile and breakable, had survived better than the monuments. But then Schwemmer noticed something in the translation that made his blood run cold. The verb tense in that final line. The specialist had noted it in a footnote. Unusual future construction, possibly subjunctive mood. suggesting doubt or fear rather than certainty. More accurate translation might be, "What we build in stone should outlast what we write in clay, but may not." The king of Kalašma had doubted, even while carving words into stone, proclaiming his achievements for eternity. He'd known it might not last. He'd built the gate anyway, written the inscription anyway, proclaimed his legacy anyway, knowing it would probably fail. Just like Tarakura, teaching Hittite scribes his dying language, writing, "I have done what I can, the rest belongs to the gods." They'd both known they were failing, and they'd tried anyway. Shwema pulled up the excavation schedule for Kalaštepe. They'd resume in spring 2026, excavate the central building, search for more inscriptions, hopefully find tablets or artifacts that explained what had happened to this kingdom. But sitting in his dark office, Shwema realized something that felt like vertigo. They would never find everyone. For every Kalašma they discovered, how many other kingdoms had vanished without leaving even a name? For every Tarakura whose preservation efforts accidentally succeeded, how many language keepers had failed completely? Linguists estimated 7,000 languages currently existed on Earth. Historical linguistics suggested hundreds of thousands had been spoken over human history. Most died without leaving a single written word. The Earth was still hiding most of human history. Of 3,000 years of Anatolian civilization before classical Greece, archaeology had recovered maybe 5%. The rest was still down there, buried under soil and forgetting. And it wasn't just Anatolia. This was true everywhere. Every landscape held lost cities, forgotten peoples, languages that had once been someone's mother tongue, someone's prayer language, someone's love poetry. All of it gone, most of it permanently. Shwema's phone buzzed, an email from a linguist in Armenia. Possible Kalašmian place names in historical Armenian texts. He stared at the notification. Then he opened a new email from an undergraduate student in Greece. "My grandmother knows a folk song that might contain Kalašmian words. Should I record it?" Another notification. A geologist in Turkey. "I found unusual stone carvings during fieldwork near Ankara. Could these be related to your discovery?" The emails kept coming. People who'd heard the story and recognized something in their own traditions, their own landscapes, their own family histories. Fragments of the past that had been invisible until someone knew to look for them. Shwema stood and walked to the window. Outside, the German city glowed with electric light, so far removed from Bronze Age Anatolia that the two worlds seemed incompatible, impossible to bridge. But they weren't incompatible. The past was still here, just hidden, still speaking, just quietly, still waiting for someone to listen. He thought about Ayşe, the Turkish grandmother, singing words she didn't understand because her mother had taught her they mattered. He thought about the king of Kalašma, carving doubts into stone while proclaiming certainty. He thought about Tarakura, writing teaching tablets for a future that would forget him for 3,000 years. They'd all tried to be remembered. Most had failed, but some hadn't. And the difference between success and failure was so arbitrary, so dependent on chance. The angle of a fire, the chemistry of soil, whether a ceiling collapsed or held, whether an excavator looked left or right, that it was almost offensive. Tarakura deserved to be remembered, yes, but so did the countless other language keepers whose tablets had dissolved, whose cities had eroded, whose names had been forgotten so completely that no one even knew to look for them. Shwema's computer chimed with another email notification, then another. People kept writing, kept reporting fragments, kept finding pieces of the past in unexpected places. The discovery of Kalašmian had opened a door. Now people were looking at their own traditions differently, wondering what else might be hidden in plain sight. How many other nonsense words in folk songs were actually ancient languages? How many place names preserved the memory of forgotten peoples? How many archaeological sites had been walked past because no one recognized what they were? A new email appeared from Dr. Elizabeth Bergen, sent at 1 a.m. her time. The subject line read, "You need to see this." Schwemmer opened it. Bergen had been reviewing the photographic archives from Hattusha again, searching for more misidentified Kalašmian fragments. She'd found something, but not what she'd been looking for. "I was checking tablets labeled unidentified language from various excavations," she wrote. "I found 3 fragments that are definitely not Kalašmian, but are also not any known Anatolian language. Daniel, I think there's another lost language in the Hattusha archives, maybe several. We need to systematically review everything that's ever been labeled uncertain or unidentified. We've been sitting on discoveries for a century and didn't know it." Schwemmer read the email twice. Then he looked at the photographs Bergen had attached. Cuneiform tablets, fragmentary, catalogued in the 1970s and filed away as language uncertain, possibly scribal errors. But they weren't scribal errors. The patterns were too consistent, too grammatically structured. This was language, coherent and intentional, written by people whose names were forgotten, whose kingdom wasn't even mentioned in passing in any surviving text. Another voice, another culture, another people who'd tried desperately to be remembered and had been forgotten anyway. Until now. Schwemmer pulled up a new document and began typing an email to the Turkish Ministry of Culture, requesting permission to expand the Kalaštepe excavation and to systematically review all unidentified tablets in museum collections. As he wrote, he thought about what the Kalašmian king had carved into stone 3,200 years ago. "Let those who enter remember, the old words have power." The old words did have power, not because they were magical or sacred, but because they were human. Because every word in every language represented someone trying to communicate, to connect, to be understood. Someone who'd loved and feared and hoped and prayed in that language. Someone who taught it to their children, sung it to their lovers, whispered it to their gods. And when a language died, all those voices died with it. All those thoughts that could only be expressed in that language. All those ways of seeing the world. All those unique cultural perspectives. Gone. But not always permanently. Sometimes, after 3,000 years of silence, someone found a clay tablet in a sealed archive. Someone heard an old song and recognized ancient words. Someone looked at a hill called Kalaštepe and wondered what was buried there. And the dead languages spoke again. Not fluently, not completely, through fragments and whispers and accidental survivals. But they spoke, and someone was listening. Schwemmer finished the email and hit send. Then he opened Bergen's photographs again, studying the unidentified tablets, trying to recognize patterns, searching for another Tarakura, another preservation effort that had accidentally succeeded. Outside his window, dawn was breaking over Würzburg. Morning light touched the old university buildings, the medieval churches, the layers of history that made up the city. Beneath those layers, beneath every city and field and mountain, the earth kept its secrets. Most of human history was still hidden, still silent, still waiting. But piece by piece, fragment by fragment, tablet by tablet, they were uncovering it. And piece by piece, fragment by fragment, word by word, the past was speaking again. Somewhere in northern Turkey, a grandmother would wake up this morning and sing an old song to her grandchildren, preserving words from a language that had been dead for 3,000 years without knowing she was doing it. Somewhere in a museum storage room, a box of tablets labeled "Language Uncertain" waited for someone to look at them with new eyes. Somewhere beneath the soil of Anatolia, more voices waited, more languages, more peoples who desperately wanted to be remembered. The earth still hid most of human history, but it wouldn't hide it forever.